This is Jennifer Gonzalez welcoming you to episode 96 of the Cult of Pedagogy podcast. In this episode, I'm going to be looking for the answer to this question. What's the point of a makerspace? For as long as I've been aware of makerspaces, I haven't quite understood them. I've seen plenty of photos on social media with the towers made of marshmallows and toothpicks. I've walked through exhibit halls at conferences where the coding and robotics displays cause me to stop, stare, and try to look like I have some idea of what I'm looking at. I even stumbled into a Twitter chat one night where a group of school librarians was throwing around some pretty great ideas about building makerspaces in their libraries. And yet, I still feel like I don't get it. I have this picture in my mind of kids kind of messing around with Legos instead of, reading primary source materials that would shed light on some period in history, or taping together some cardboard strips to make it into a car, or attaching some kind of wire to a banana. And the more traditional, stodgy, control freak part of me says it looks like a bunch of hooey. But some of the smartest people I know are pretty into makerspaces. And the part of me that's not a stodgy control freak, the part that knows there's a lot about tradition that we need to question, that part of me wants to find out once and for all what's so great about makerspaces. So I asked one of those smart people, my friend John Spencer, who was a classroom teacher for a number of years and currently teaches at the university level. He's also the co-author with AJ Giuliani of the books Launch, Using Design Thinking to Boost Creativity and Bring Out the Maker in Every Student, and Empower, What Happens When Students Own Their Learning. He also teaches online courses about project-based learning, design thinking, and makerspaces. And I really trust his thinking. So I knew he was a great choice to come on the podcast and help me demystify the makerspace. In this episode, John and I look at what a makerspace actually is and how the definition is actually a lot broader than you might think. We also talk about the value a makerspace can offer to any classroom, how to keep a makerspace from becoming totally chaotic, and where to begin if you want to put together your first makerspace. Before we get started, I'd like to thank our sponsor, PeerGrade. PeerGrade is a platform that makes it easy to facilitate peer review in your classroom. Students review each other's work, while PeerGrade takes care of anonymously assigning reviewers and delivering all the relevant insights to teachers. With PeerGrade, students learn to think critically and take ownership of their learning. They also learn to write kind and useful feedback for their peers. PeerGrade is free to use for teachers and students. To learn more, visit cultofpedagogy.com/peergrade, PeerGrade. Support for this episode also comes from Microsoft OneNote Class Notebook. OneNote Class Notebooks have a personal workspace for every student, a content library for handouts, and a collaboration space for lessons and creative activities. The collaboration space encourages students to work together as the teacher provides real-time feedback and coaching. Teachers can provide individualized support by typing, writing, or inserting audio or video directly into each student's private notebook. OneNote is free and available on any platform. Learn more at onenote.com/classnotebook. And last but not least, I just want to thank you so much for your reviews on iTunes. Those make such a difference, and I read them every week. So thank you so much for helping to bring more visibility to this podcast. It's helping to get a lot of other teachers to come and listen. So if you haven't left a review before and you would like to support what I'm doing, just go over to iTunes, find the Cult of Pedagogy podcast, and leave me a review. Now here is my interview with John Spencer. The reason that I invited you on the podcast is because you do a lot of work with design thinking and makerspaces. And although I am no longer in the classroom, I know that if I were, I would probably be that teacher who saw the makerspace movement come along and thought, I don't even know why I would need to want to bother with that. And I was a middle school English teacher. So I'm sort of coming at this interview with you with the attitude. I'm sort of asking the questions that I think that type of teacher would ask. Like, what is the point of this? Why would I need it? How does it help kids? Why is it good for learning? So let's just start by you giving us a little bit of a background about the work that you do and sort of how you came to care so much about makerspaces and design thinking.
So, but a little bit about my background. I was the same type of teacher. So, if something became popular, if it seemed like it was a fad at all, I was always the teacher who kind of rejected it,
Mhm.
or at least took things with skepticism. And so I never bought into the flipped classroom thing when that was popular. I've never been really into interactive notebooks. When anchor charts first became all the rage, I just didn't like them. And I had my reasons why for each of those things. But so I'll point out that being a skeptic is a beautiful thing.
Hmm.
So I taught for 12 years in a Title I school in Phoenix, Arizona. And now for the last 3 years, I have been a college professor. I'm also an author, a blogger, a maker. And I'm passionate about seeing classrooms become bastions of creativity and wonder. I mean, that is what I'm all about. And so um, for me, I first got into, I'm going to clarify terms for a second, if that's all
Yeah,
right. I know
yeah.
this is getting a little
No,
off
no, no,
script,
that's
but
good.
um, so I see a makerspace as simply a space designed and dedicated to hands-on creativity. And the key thing there is they're actually making something. Creativity is sometimes idea generation, it's sometimes problem solving, but a makerspace, you're actually going to create some kind of product. Now, it could be a digital product. It could be a physical product, but there's an actual product. So you're not going to say design an event or a service project. That's not what a makerspace is for. So it's a space devoted to and differentiated and set up for making.
Mhm.
Design thinking is a process, or if you're Canadian, it's a process. For I learned that they always say
Yeah,
process.
they do.
So it's a process for getting the most out of creativity, and in particular, design thinking typically is empathy driven, and you're really focused on solving a problem that is actually impacting people. And so for design thinking, it may be a physical product, but it could also be a service event. It could be, something different than just something that you specifically make. And so while a makerspace is more about the space, design thinking is a process.
Okay.
And the maker movement is just the larger movement of getting people involved in some kind of um, hands-on making.
Got it. Got it. Okay. So, as we've sort of already established, the term makerspace and this whole maker movement has really gotten quite big in the last couple of years. So, if a person is here's what my impression is when I hear makerspace, I picture a corner of a room and it has like Legos and cardboard and post-it notes and pipe cleaners um and I don't quite know what students are doing with it, maybe building a tower out of toothpicks and cardboard, and I don't quite know why they're doing those things. So if if I'm if I'm a teacher with a curriculum, and let for right now, let's not necessarily look at specific, but like if I'm teaching, say, language arts or social studies or science, like why would I want to add a makerspace to my classroom?
So, I first set up a makerspace in my classroom actually when I was teaching social studies, which is typically not right. I mean, we
Mm.
hear STEM, we hear STEAM, um, and the one left out subject in the midst of all of that ends up being history. And so, again, I go back to this idea that the makerspace is simply a way of thinking about your space so that you have differentiated it and allow for multiple hands on making to occur within that space. And so when I taught social studies, we did have a prototyping area. We were making some things with duct tape and cardboard sometimes. We did have an entrepreneurial thing where they would design prototypes. We had some circuitry work being done. And those fit in with a particular economics unit we were doing. But then those supplies were gone when we were focused on a different type of project. And so in our makerspace in social studies, we had a green screen, we had podcasting area, because all of that is hands-on making as well. We had whiteboards where they were doing whiteboard videos, and it looked a lot more like a media studio. When we shifted into STEM, it looked a lot more like an engineering space. I would argue both of those were maker spaces. So anytime you're doing something where you're physically making a product, whether that product is digital or whether it's tangible, and you want to differentiate the space effectively and allow people to move between those spaces, that's when you design a maker space.
Okay. Let's I want to rewind a little bit to something you just said. You were talking about a project that you did, and this was in social studies, and it was something that you did with circuitry. What was that? What was that? What was that project? Because I think hearing examples is really going to help people understand how this all fits together.
Well, the circuitry project fit into an entrepreneurial project. So we were basically doing like a Shark Tank style project.
Okay.
And so what I had for that was we were bringing in some elements of engineering into it. And at this point, I was tying it in with some math that they were learning. And so we were doing some kind of multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary things. I was on a middle school team, and so I was a social studies teacher, but I was also really focusing on how to do persuasive text and how to do informational text, and in particular, more the functional style of informational text. And so at that point, I pulled the standards that fit in with those, and they did these, Shark Tank pitches, and they had to physically make specific things. And so because of that, I brought in some types of things that they could make, and circuitry was just one of the areas that they could get into. We did a lot more of the circuitry in STEM later when I taught a STEM block. But that was just one of the examples of where they could do that. A lot of students were making things with cardboard and duct tape. I never did the Lego thing, which would have been fine. But we did a little bit, along with the circuitry things, we had some robotics that they could work on. And it was all tied to this entrepreneurial unit that they were doing that connected to economics.
Okay. I'm sitting here racking my brain thinking, what is the social studies tie?
Yeah.
I got you now. So you ended up tying that into a lot of other, like the economics-based standards.
Yeah, because I think what I've seen is that social studies isn't, I don't want to get too much into this, but social studies isn't just history, right? You have all these standards that are supposed to be taught. And what I saw in our curriculum map is we didn't even address the economic standards that by law we were supposed to teach. And so I put together this entrepreneurial unit. It was a week-long unit. It was interdisciplinary. Like I said, we brought in a lot of research that they had to do. And it was an example of where we were using the makerspace and we were using kind of design thinking as our framework within the makerspace. And then I also did, and this is I love the term that you use. I use this all the time. It was a lame duck session, right? So it was also done at a time where it was the week of makeup state testing. Wow. So we kind of had this week where I actually wanted to teach the standards and not just show, a video or anything like that. And so it fit in perfectly.
If somebody needs to be convinced, like if I'm thinking, why is it worth the trouble to have this making going on in my classroom? How does it benefit the students?
So I would say it benefits the students in a couple of different ways. The first way is that we know that students learn at a deeper level and they retain more when they're engaged in creative thinking, connecting to the subject, right? I mean, that's Bloom's taxonomy, that's depths of knowledge, that's everything that we know about learning, that when they're engaged in creative thinking, they will learn it at a deeper level. So to begin with, just within the content area, That's going to allow for deeper learning.
Okay.
The second thing that I think about is the maker mindset is the goal, right? The space is just how you set up your space, but what you're wanting them to develop is a maker mindset. And for me, this is where I'm really passionate, because there was a time when you could follow the formula, and the formula was basically work hard at school, go to college, and climb a corporate ladder.
Mm-hmm.
But because of the complex global economy, because of the creative economy, the information economy, our students are going to have to navigate a maze. The ladder is now a maze. And because it's a maze, what do they need in order to navigate that? They need to be able to engage in iterative thinking, creative thinking, critical thinking. They need to know how to pivot, how to change, how to revise, how to persevere. They need to solve complex problems. They need to think divergently. Well, all of those are involved in that maker mindset. And so if you can embed that maker mindset inside of the curriculum and you tap into the standards that you're teaching, then they're able to develop that maker mindset. And again, the space is just the platform that facilitates it.
Okay. Let's maybe walk through a couple more examples of you know, uh, different subject areas, different grade levels, so
Absolutely.
that teachers can see how does this actually look in practice. So we've got this one idea with the entrepreneurial stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so let's do something else.
All right. So I taught, after teaching social studies, I shifted into self-contained, and that's where I taught the STEM block and I taught the humanities block. And so obviously that's kind of a lot of, well, that's every subject, but taught in a way that's a little bit interdisciplinary.
Okay.
So I'm going to give examples from each of those.
Okay.
So one of them is in our humanities class, we were constantly doing creative projects. We filmed documentaries. We recorded podcasts. There were some times where they did some more kind of hands-on making, like building catapults to try to figure out how you would get through a medieval fortress and things like that. And there were challenges connecting to it. And it really depended on the subject and the standards. And the key thing there was it was very topic driven, because we had these specific topics we had to cover in history. And there wasn't a lot of free choice on the topics, but there was a lot of free choice on how we got there. And that's where the hands-on making, there was a lot of freedom in terms of how we could actually do some creative thinking within it. The key piece is it had to feel real to the students. And so I think the worst ones are those projects that feel like recipes. They're the ones that have pseudo context where it doesn't actually fit the way people learn. But these were authentic because it felt authentic to the students. And again, there were a lot of media literacy involved. In the midst of it, students were constantly engaging in research. A pet peeve of mine is that teachers often do research at the very end of the year as a last thing.
Yeah.
They do their animal research project, right? And
Right.
to me, research is an embedded part of what they should be doing all the time in writing. So sometimes this was blogging, writing, whiteboard videos, green screen videos, podcasts, all of these things. And that's what the Makerspace really looked like in the humanities class.
Okay. So it wasn't so much like cutting up cardboard and.
No, it really
Okay.
wasn't. Now, there were times when it was, like I said, the entrepreneurial thing, the catapult thing, but it had to specifically fit it. You don't do World War II and decide to do a craft on the Holocaust. That's a disrespectful way to learn about the Holocaust, right?
Right.
You do a documentary where you actually get the chance to interview a Holocaust survivor and really hear the stories.
Right.
So you have to make sure that the context fits. And again, in this case, there's not, we're not cutting felt pieces. There's no pipe cleaners. That's not what we were doing in the humanities side. On the other hand, in the STEM class, we were constantly doing that. And so, again, sometimes this was reinforcing the math concepts we learned. So I'll give some examples that are more science math related.
Okay.
We did the create a roller coaster project, and that was forces and motion and things like that. And another one was the tiny house project. So we looked at examples of, what is a tiny house. And that was very much the hands-on cardboard duct tape, that style. And the tiny house project was very challenge driven. And they were learning volume, surface area, and proportional reasoning, which were the three lowest standards. Now, a lot of people ask the question, well, how do they do on the test? They aced the test when it came to volume, surface area, and proportional reasoning. And the reason why is teachers typically practice the algorithm, and then students would take a test where there were all these word problems. The assumption is that kids don't understand word problems because they can't read them. But what they actually lack is the ability to connect the context of math to the math concepts they've been learning. And so this reinforced that. Now, I want to point out, I still did some lecture. We still did small group problem solving. We actually did, God forbid, worksheets, right?
Yeah.
Those things still happened.
Right.
They're not all evil. I'm not saying you just throw everything out and make your class a makerspace.
Right.
But the makerspace was available for those times that we were engaged in that.
Okay. I want to drill down a little bit more into this example, because this tiny house thing. So they're making tiny houses. And one of the things you said a few minutes ago is that what you didn't want was pseudo context and recipes. So what were they actually tasked with doing?
So they were all given a specific scenario of people who would want a tiny house.
Okay.
Right? Because those have become really popular.
Okay.
And they are competing in their mini architecture firms, basically, for the best tiny house design.
Okay.
And the criteria for the competition is, most innovative solutions, how multifunctional is it, and would people actually choose this particular tiny house?
Okay.
So they're given a list of specific needs that the family would have in wanting this particular tiny house. And not every group has the same clients, people that they're working for, clients, basically. Yeah. And this was actually, I did this twice for 2 different years. This actually worked best with partners and not small groups. So that's part of why I broke it up into different clients and different pairs.
Okay.
And so they had to, create a description of it, create a walkthrough for it, design a small website that would go with it, and then have their physical prototype that they could walk people through.
Okay.
And the physical prototype had to have proportional reasoning. And so what they're doing a ton of is, if this is this long and this is this long, then how long would that need to be in order to solve it? And so all they're doing is reinforcing it. There's rules about the parameters that it has to be, and they're looking at, and they're being forced to solve problems like how much of the space is devoted to this, how much of the space is devoted to that, and that's where you're kind of getting into the volume, surface area pieces that they're practicing at the same time.
So how would that actually? What would that look like on a day when they're like? What I'm wondering about is, when does this sort of vocabulary of proportional reasoning come into play? Is it while they're like working with the physical pieces to try to put them together, or is it while they're like sketching things out on graph paper?
It's really happening in both places. So it really begins, they're starting to sketch it out with graph paper as they're learning the concepts of proportional reasoning in class. Okay. Right? So there's some direct instruction on proportional reasoning. There's some hands-on things that they're doing in terms of just measuring things around the room. And all of that's happening. And then they move into the graph paper piece, and they're actually sketching that out, and they're looking at it. And there's reflective questions that we're asking, determine the surface area of the bedroom. And then what is the ratio of the bedroom to the kitchen? Is that a reasonable ratio if you're actually going to have living space? If you want most of your space should be, and so it's a lot of that. And a lot of it's verbal. I mean, a lot of it's quick problem solving. And what they're doing is they're getting the repetition that they need in math.
Yeah.
But it's not just a worksheet.
Right. I made myself a little note here to remind me to ask you about 3D printers, because that seems to have come along with the maker movement. What's your opinion about them?
So I think there's a lot of amazing things that can go into a makerspace, a 3D printer, CAD machines, and this and that. My issue with a 3D printer is that often 3D printers are, I mean, they're basically, it's the same thing as a printer. It's just 3D, right? So if a student downloads something online, like a keychain or something, and they just customize a few pieces and 3D print that, how is that any different from, a kid downloading an image from Google Images, plopping that onto a sheet of paper, writing something underneath it and printing it? Where's the problem solving? Where's the creativity? And so my issue with 3D printers, and this is what part of why I didn't have one, we were also poor because we were in Arizona. And so we just didn't have the money for it. But my issue with 3D printers, and again, they're not awful, but if we want students to be doing hands-on making and physically prototyping and engaged in that iterative thinking where they're tweaking things, often in a 3D printer, that's not possible.
Right.
You see? And so I'm not opposed to 3D printers. I just think for as expensive as they are, now they've gotten a lot cheaper. I'm just skeptical because unless they really learn how to use 3D modeling software, which is a lot of work to learn. It's like learning Photoshop. There's nothing wrong with that. But if that's what they're doing, I'm just a little more skeptical about whether or not the machine's doing more of the thinking for the students, or they're actually engaged in the creative thinking.
So if a school is really wanting to move in the direction of doing more makerspace stuff, the purchase of a 3D printer is not a must-have.
I don't think it's a must-have. I mean, I think there are I would rather that money be spent on things like robotics, circuitry, materials, raw materials. Now, there's, again, nothing wrong with having that 3D printer, but I think sometimes we get so focused on the stuff that we forget that what makes a makerspace is that there's actually making going on there.
Okay, let's talk for just a minute about the robotics, because as soon as you said that, a small part of my brain went into like deer in the headlights mode. Because I've been to ISTE, I've seen all the robotics. I've got a section in my tech guide on robotics, but I still feel like the blind leading the blind, because I still don't quite get the applicability. So what do you really like out there right now in terms of the robotics kits, and how do you see those playing into maybe, like a 6th, 7th grade classroom?
So I really think robotics kits and certain things like that are very engineering driven fit really well with certain areas of science, and then also the logic side of math. Okay. But again, they're a little more subject specific. So I would just point that out. I couldn't think of too many areas where robotics fits into, say, a social studies class. But what I love about robotics is that there's a good chance to learn programming and there's a good chance to learn logic as you work on something and maneuver it and make it do specific things. The other thing I like about it is that typically you don't have to be an expert on robotics to make to have students engage in robotics. So the kits themselves usually have a pretty good amount of instructions. Students learn how to read the instructions, they play around, they explore, and then slowly they start modifying it. And I think that's a piece of creativity that sometimes people forget, is there's often this shift from sort of awareness into consuming, into copying, into modifying, into full-scale creativity. And we need to let students walk through that process. And that's what I love about having them do something like robotics. The same thing happened when they were, doing whiteboard videos for the first time. I would love to say that they just knew how to make it happen, but I had to walk them through a tutorial, and they watched it, consumed it. They copied my style the first time, and then they started kind of hacking it. And then next thing you know, they were actually kind of creating their own style and doing something different.
That's so interesting, because that's exactly how I teach kids how to write. We read a lot in the genre. We sort of break it apart. How did this writer do this? And then you do a lot of scaffolding, and eventually they're able to sort of write their own thing in that genre. So I never really thought about that in terms of robotics, but gosh, I'm just really glad you said that. Um, of all of the sort of products that are out there right now in robotics, like right now I'm thinking about like Spheros and Lego Mindstorms and Little Bits. And what have you played around with a lot of those? Do you have sort of a favorite?
I still, my favorite, I mean, we did this with part of a STEM camp that I did with my last school district. I still really liked the Lego robotics.
Mm-hmm.
They've been around for a while, and I think they're solid. But honestly, a lot of robotics kits will have some component where they program,
Mm-hmm.
and I like that because I think when students learn how to program a robot versus just
Yeah.
build, it's the same thing with Scratch. The learning of language and logic together, I think it's the thinking that's involved that allows them to become systems thinkers. And when they're great systems thinkers, they can navigate
Mm-hmm.
complexity. And so I actually think that like learning how to program is so much closer to learning, say, a foreign language than it is to something that we typically think is makery. But the thinking involved is really
Yeah,
similar.
yeah. And then that transfers. My son right now is doing a Genius Hour project on coding, and he's very, very, very early in it because
Hmm.
he's 10, and he's just now trying to learn like
Yeah.
which language do I even learn? And like so much of the research that we're doing on this together is telling him it doesn't matter. Like pick one. What
No, it
it's
doesn't.
the thinking that
Yeah,
you're
and even early on, I mean, early on, like having them do things on Scratch, and again, like this is something I would have. I had programming as part of our makerspace in science. Um, Something like Scratch is perfect for that because learning the logic and manipulation is the hardest side. It's that systems thinking, and then the language comes in, and it's really just putting a vocabulary to processes.
Let's shift over to the concept of sort of managing a makerspace. If a teacher wants
Hmm.
to sort of designate a space in their classroom for this, and they don't tolerate mess and disorder very well, do you have any tips? I'm especially thinking about because if we're talking about things like podcasting and green screen, that is a little bit easier, I would think. But if
Hmm.
you've got two or three groups of kids working on tiny houses, how do you manage that mess
Hmm.
ongoing over the course of a week?
Yeah. So I want to point this out. I always hear people in the maker community who say things like, uh, embrace the chaos, embrace the noise, learning should be messy. I mean, these are the phrases we
Yeah.
hear all the time. But as a middle school teacher with a space that was not incredibly large and, 38 students in there, I did have to manage the noise and the chaos and everything else. And just a personal confession here, I don't. I'm not somebody who deals well with
Me
noise and
neither.
chaos. Um, I've got 3 kids at home, and I can tell you, my kids are not the type who are running and screaming through the house and jumping on the couch and stuff like that. Like that's not the kind of house
Mhm.
I have, or we have, I should say. My wife and I like I need. Um, a certain level of calmness and quiet built into where I am. Otherwise, I personally get edgy. I get anxious. It feels
Yeah.
unsafe to me, even if
Yep.
it's not unsafe. And that's not every teacher, but that's my comfort level. I'll also point out that if that's true of me, that's probably true of certain
Mm.
students. So for that reason, I always said, we're going to have some rules and procedures and things like that. And so, the upside that I will say is I had some cringeworthy classroom management moments as a teacher over 12 years. Uh, there are some times where, seventh and eighth graders will push buttons. I know that's a little surprising, but and I didn't always
Yeah.
respond well. I had some times I yelled at my class and apologized. I had some times where I, shamed a student and I was so embarrassed. Um, but that being said, those moments almost always happened in the midst of direct
Hmm.
instruction, and it almost always happened when kids were bored and confused.
Yeah.
Those moments never happened when we were in a makerspace. And I think it's because a part of the upside of it is when kids are engaged, fully engaged in their learning, there's less incentive to goof off,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And so I think about a couple of, education theory. I know it's cult of pedagogy here, so I can like geek out
Oh
for a
yeah.
second. You think about Schlechte's levels of engagement. At the very top, you have the student who's engaged and they have high attention, high focus, high everything, high interest. They love what they're doing. At the very bottom, you have the students who are in rebellion. They have no focus. They're actively diverting attention. Well, if it's meaningful to students and they're engaged in creative thinking and they're solving problems and it's hands-on, then in those moments, there's not an incentive to rebel and act crazy.
Right.
So you begin with that, right? It's the same thing, often what would happen is we would actually kind of hit a state of flow in the classroom and it got quieter and there was sort of this hyper focus and people would walk in and say things like, I thought they were making stuff, or I thought we were doing this, or I thought we were, and it was kind of quiet. That being said, yes, there were some times where it could get loud. When we were testing our roller coasters, it was crazy loud in there. And, because it was the testing day, right? They're prototyping and they're testing and they're screaming and cheering when it works. But there was a difference between a boisterous, happy, cheering loud versus an off-task loud, right?
Yeah.
So the lesson there for me was, focus on the engagement, go preventative, and then in the midst of all of that, embed moments of silence into the makerspace. So I would still have some times where I would say, hey guys, we're moving into silent mode for 2 minutes so that you can process and think about what you're working on. Or I want you to I'm going to give you a prompt. You don't have to write it down, but I just want you to think through this question about what you're learning. And that would allow them to kind of recenter. And it was just, 2 minutes of silence is not much, but it just was enough to kind of restore certain students who were getting tired of the noise. And then they could come back in.
Gosh, I love this idea of giving them just a thinking prompt. They don't have to write it down, but you just have everybody hush and think about it for a while, right in the middle of an active project. That's good, John.
Thank you. The last thing I'll say is, it is a different type of space and it's a different type of learning that's going on. And so the other thing is there is nothing wrong with coming up with makerspace rules, especially if you go at it democratically, and then walking through the procedures and just reminding students, hey guys, we have robotics here. They're kind of breakable. What do we do about that? Hey, quick reminder, you could be excited and there's free movement from table to table, but that shouldn't mean that you run between tables. I'm just thinking about some of the younger primary grades that I've seen where you really have to teach the students specific procedures and there's nothing wrong with that.
Right. Yeah, and I'm thinking too that it's an opportunity to sort of co-construct that stuff even with them and make that even a bigger part of the lesson. So that's fantastic. Okay, so I wanted to talk about no. If a person wants to start a makerspace in their own classroom, okay, what would you recommend that they start with?
So I would start not with the space, but I would start with a maker project.
Okay.
And so I would say begin with a maker project and decide what you're going to have kids create that's hands-on. And you might do multiple maker projects in different locations, or you might have the entire class do one thing. And either option works. We did something... I started something at the beginning of the year called Maker Mondays, and there's different teachers who have been doing that. They've been sharing it out on Twitter, sharing it on Facebook. But it's the idea that instead of waiting for Fun Fridays as like the cool day where you do something fun, you just start your week off on a Monday and you have students do some kind of maker activity to spark that creativity at the beginning of the week.
Oh, that's a great idea.
And so... this was more sort of your K-5 teachers who teach multiple subjects. And a lot of them said, that they would have students before that, talking about their weekend and sharing how things had gone Well, this lets them still do that with each other. They still want to be
Mm.
social, but it also took some of the pressure off of students who maybe didn't have a great weekend. And this is always something I'm a little bit sensitive to because of the students that I taught. When a student's coming from trauma, they don't want to rewalk the trauma
Mm.
when they come back into class,
Mm.
right? So asking them to talk about their weekend, I don't think is the best way to start a Monday.
Yeah. Ugh.
And so instead, getting them excited about creating, and for some, it's a chance to talk about their fun weekend, but for others, it's a chance to escape into a refuge that's creativity at the beginning of the week. And so I love this idea of kind of starting with the Maker Monday. And I did that even though I taught 7th and 8th grade self-contained. I did that at the beginning of the week every single Monday as the way we would start our week off. Now, I will say that if you are interested in kind of starting a makerspace and you want to move it to the next level, I think there's a couple of different options. And so I'm going to try to walk through these quickly. The first one is a mobile makerspace. And this is if you don't want to totally redesign your classroom, but you want to be able to use it, a makerspace, you basically sort of like what you have with a computer cart, you put together a mobile makerspace cart. And you put the items in different boxes, you label them, you put them onto a cart or a couple different carts, and then you can move them from classroom to classroom. And I've seen teachers on a team do this where a teacher will basically say, I want to use a makerspace type thing. We're all doing a STEM activity, but I want to use the makerspace today, and then tomorrow I want to give that to another teacher and they can have that in their
Mm.
classroom, or they can just physically move
Mm-hmm.
classrooms. And so that's kind of one way that you can do it, is having this sort of mobile makerspace. Another thing that you can do is you can have those makerspace items kind of put together, and you set up a station rotation and you move students systematically through those
Mm-hmm.
centers where they do some type of maker activity.
Okay.
And then the other option is to do something similar to that, but basically at all times in your classroom, have sort of a makerspace type of classroom, and still have tables and everything, and have those items available. And then what you're doing is you're just differentiating the space. So at any time during the day, if someone wants to go to the corner and use the green screen, they can. If they want to use the podcasting area and you've got, soundproof, not wordproof, sorry, soundproof foam that they can talk into that cancels out the noise,
Yeah.
you do that and they can move. And so the class is sort of permanently a makerspace, and you can just use the space whenever you want to. So it really depends on your style. If you think that those items will be a distraction, then I think having it as stations or mobile makerspaces works best. But if you think that I always want to have a makerspace at all times, whether we use it as a makerspace or not, then something like a differentiated space model might work better.
And if somebody's sort of like, I don't think I even need it, is there any way that they could sort of like dip their toes lightly into, like, I'm thinking, a cart or something that has what would be on that, especially if it was me teaching language arts, like what could be in a makerspace cart for me?
And you're thinking language arts, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So it would really depend on the standards, because language arts is so topic neutral, right? So
Mm-hmm.
you could actually have something very engineering oriented. You could have the duct tape and the cardboard and the circuitry. I wouldn't do robotics in the initial part for language arts, and have a very hands-on maker space mobile cart, and then the standards that students would be working on would be functional writing. So writing the directions for how to do a particular thing, or describing how to make it something. Maybe they're designing something in particular using those, and then they have to create an ad campaign that would go
Mm.
with it. I personally think students should be learning marketing at a much younger
Mm-hmm.
age, both to see how things get manipulated
Mm.
to them, but also to understand the kind of the art of
Got it.
persuasion. And so, you could set that up. I would say the items that I would put for a first time makerspace is I would have um, some kind of physical prototyping items, like duct tape, cardboard, packing
Mm-hmm.
tape,
Mm-hmm.
that type of stuff. I would have circuitry. So because it's so inexpensive and easy to do, I would buy like a one or two snap circuits. I would have a couple computers devoted specifically to um, using something like Hour of Code or Scratch, and then I would probably do some of have a podcasting area and a green
Got
screen
it.
area.
Okay. Let's talk for a few minutes about your course. You teach an online course about makerspaces, and you also have a free webinar that teachers can go to sort of
Mhm.
learn a little bit more about some of the things that we've talked about. So tell us a little bit about what the course itself actually does.
So the goal of the course is to walk you through how you would create a makerspace in a week. So um, how you would design it in a week, and the focus of it is how do we create makerspaces with intentionality.
Mhm.
How do you connect maker projects to the standards? How do you think through all of the classroom management components? There's the creation of a classroom management plan that you would have. How do you communicate this with parents who are skeptical, administrators who
Mhm.
are skeptical? What types of items do you put into your makerspace? How do you arrange the physical space for optimization? Which type of makerspace model would you choose? Again, the mobile model, the differentiated space. What type of model would work best for you? And the goal is that you that you in the end have a plan set up. You don't physically have to have made your entire makerspace in a week, but that you have a full scale plan set up in a week so that you could implement that either in the summer or at the end of the school year, whenever you think would work best, and then kind of test it out at that point. As you do that, the finished product you submit to me, and I give feedback on it. You can ask me any questions throughout the course. So I get a lot of people who ask very specific makerspace questions connecting to their space that they're creating, and we just have a quick coaching conversation.
Oh, that's great. I don't think I even realized that
Yeah.
people can get personal coaching from this too. And in the
Yeah.
webinar, I don't know if this is true for the course, but I know that in the webinar you actually offer some free downloadable makerspace projects. Like I think the tiny houses project is in there, is it not? Or is that in the
Yep.
course?
Yeah. Yes. I believe that's in the webinar. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to be providing people with links to learn more about that. If they're really sold on the idea of makerspaces and they want to learn more, that they can go to either one of those resources and really dig in. So just real quick, tell us where people can find you online.
So my blog is spencerauthor.com, and you can contact me at john@spencerauthor.com. I have a Facebook page, and it's facebook.com/spencereducation.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a YouTube channel that is spencervideos.com. So just my last name and videos.com. Oh, yeah. And I'm on Twitter at Spencer Ideas. I forgot about that one.
Cool.
I'm sometimes on Twitter. When I'm writing a novel, I'm not on Twitter.
Oh, and you are writing a novel right now.
So, yeah.
John is going to become super, super famous, we've decided.
It's not true.
I think you've got such a cool idea. I'm just going to put it down on record right now that you're going to eventually be a big deal. So, a bigger deal than I think you are right now. Okay, I guess we're done for now. We'll probably get back together after you've written this novel.
All right.
Thank you so much, John.
Thank you.
For links to all the resources mentioned in this episode, including John's Makerspace course, visit cultofpedagogy.com, click podcast, and choose episode 96. To get a weekly email from me about my newest blog posts, podcast episodes, and products, sign up for my mailing list at cultofpedagogy.com/subscribe. Thanks so much for listening, and have a great day. This podcast is a proud member of the Education Podcast Network. Podcasts for educators, podcasts by educators. To learn more, visit edupodcastnetwork.com.